This week on Engage the Sage.
Hi everyone, I'm Don Saucier. Welcome to this week's episode of Engage the Sage. This week, I'm going to talk about how to avoid grade arguments with your students. We're getting closer to the end of the semester, and what that means is that grades are going to start to come due. Students are going to start to submit assignments, they're going to start to get grades on those assignments, and some students are going to reach out and maybe argue that their grade is not what they think it should have been. Sometimes when those students reach out, there's going to be a legitimate concern that we can handle. Other times, I'm going to optimistically say maybe they're a little bit more hopeful that we're going to make a change that they actually don't deserve. So what I'm going to talk about today are things that we can do as instructors to minimize, because we can't completely eliminate, but to minimize students reaching out to us and arguing about the grades that they receive. The first set of recommendations that I'm going to make are things that I'm going to recommend you do before your students submit their assignments in your class. My first recommendation here is going to be to set your students up to succeed on those assignments. Throughout this video, I'm using the term assignments, but when I mean assignments, I mean everything. These could be reflections, these could be research papers, these could be exams, these could be quizzes, these could be anything. So before your students are going to submit the assignment, you're going to give them the assignment details, the parameters and the guidelines. You want to make sure there's enough information about the assignment for your students to be able to reasonably succeed. I say this all the time. Prevention is better than intervention. So anything we can do to prevent the students failing, or at least failing to whatever their standard is, anything we do to boost their success is going to make it less likely that they're going to reach out and argue their grade. So I recommend making it very clear what you want on the assignment. What are you going to have them do? What learning are they going to demonstrate? What student learning outcomes are going to be expressed in that assignment? What content should they be demonstrating their mastery of? You'll also want to be clear about the format that you expect that assignment to be submitted in, so any length guidelines or things like that. If you want sections or headings or titles or any of those kind of things, if you want references, how many, anything you can do to make the structure and formatting of your assignment clear and to make the expectation for the assignment clear is going to help your students do that assignment. When they do well on the assignment, they're probably not going to argue their grade. This is also where you want to be clear about what resources are available to your students. Can they use things like library resources? Can they use artificial intelligence like ChatGPT? Can they work together? These are things that you're going to want to put in those assignment guidelines so your students know what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. And ideally, you'll let them know why. I like to provide my students recommendations for how to succeed on the assignments. So I'll often say, if you want to demonstrate you're learning well and earn lots of points, these are things that I would recommend that you do. I also might let them know about common mistakes or pitfalls that previous students have shown me in other semesters and saying, hey, I've seen students do this and that didn't really work out well for them. Please do this other thing instead. Providing those very specific guidelines, even making a video about ways to succeed in my class or on this assignment will be helpful to make sure your students are succeeding, or at least that it's reasonable that they do so. Another little bit of information that I would include with this assignment is how much the assignment is worth. So if your class is based on points like mine is, letting them know how many points that is and maybe what percentage of the grade is related to that number of points. Providing this context about how much it counts in your class is particularly helpful because if your students are like mine, my class might be one of 4, 5, or 6 classes they're taking, and that information, despite it being on the syllabus, might be really easy to forget. Another recommendation that I'm going to make to support your students' success on the assignment so they're not arguing the grades is to make sure that you have given them reasonable notice to complete the assignment. This simply means you have to give them enough time. So you're going to make the assignment available early enough so they can reasonably do it. I also recommend you give periodic reminders that the assignment is coming up. I even have my students make the reminders back to me at the start of my classes so that I'm making sure that the assignment does not catch them unawares and so that they can submit it, demonstrate their learning, earn lots of points, and not argue with me. Some other information to make your students aware of related to their assignments so they're going to do well and not argue is letting them know what your course policies are. This might include whether or not you're going to accept late work, and if you accept late work, what a penalty might be. This might include how your grading scale is going to work. This might be how much the points are going to be worth on this, whether or not there's going to be bumping or rounding of those points after the students have earned them. One thing you might even want to do to make sure your students are aware of your course policies as it relates to that assignment or otherwise is maybe having a quiz about those so that they can demonstrate their knowledge of those policies. And then if a student later on says that they don't know, you might have evidence to the contrary. Another thing to make your students aware of prior to them completing their assignments is what the grading rubric for that assignment is going to be. Here, you can take your expectations and actually organize them along with what it's going to take to earn the points for each of those components and how much each of those components are worth. This makes it really easy for students to understand what they're supposed to be demonstrating in terms of their learning on your assignments. Another thing that I recommend that you allow your students to do before that assignment is due is to reach out to you with questions. You could do this in class, you could do this in student hours, you can do this in appointments in person over Zoom, but give your students the opportunity, encourage them and mean it, to ask questions about the assignment because, and they should know this, you want them to demonstrate their learning well and to succeed in your class. All right, so you've done all of that. Now the assignment comes in, and my next set of recommendations are going to relate to now how you process those assignments. My first recommendation here goes back to that rubric we talked about. You are going to use that clear rubric to grade the assignments that your students submit. I much prefer in grading, and it keeps me much more consistent, to have, rather than just one overarching grade, to have subcomponents on my assignments that have smaller grades associated with them with specific points of mastery that those points correspond to. And this is going to relate to my next recommendation, that you're going to provide feedback to your students as it relates to the rubric that coincides with the points that they earned. A real easy way to invite grade arguments from your students is to give them points or grades without letting them know why. The rubric and the feedback will help them know why. Another thing I'm going to recommend when you're grading, you're going to be consistent, you're going to be fair, and you're going to try really hard not to make mistakes. For me, this is going to mean I'm not going to grade when I'm tired, and I'm not going to grade when I'm in a bad mood. I'm also going to take breaks in my grading to keep me refreshed and energized as I go through, because sometimes the grading process itself can be fatiguing. And I might have a GTA, a graduate teaching assistant, or a colleague spot check my grades for me to make sure that I'm being consistent. If you make a mistake in grading and a student argues that mistake, you should fix it. So one of the ways we can avoid grade arguments is not making those mistakes. So now we've given the assignment, the students have completed the assignment, we have graded the assignment, now we are releasing grades back to the students. And my next recommendations are going to be at this point in the process. So now that students have their grades, there is the potential that some might reach out to you, maybe over email, and ask to meet about their grade or even to argue their grade in that email. And here's why I might recommend that you pre-craft your email responses to those queries. At the end of the semester, for instance, after my final exam is done, I might have students who are asking me to bump their overall grades for the semester. Maybe they earned 87% of the points over the semester. They'd rather earn 90 because that relates to a letter grade of A, so they ask me for that 3% bump. What I typically will do is send every student the same message that says, "Thank you so much for your message. The grades in my class right now are final. I hope all is well." What I'm doing is I'm avoiding arguing with the student on a point-by-point basis, for instance. I'm just letting them know, and hopefully I've done this. I've made sure that my grading is fair. I've made sure that it makes sense. I've made sure it's consistent with my rubric. And I'm letting them know at this point, it's over. I really like these simple messages. If the student sends me another one, I'll reply with the same message. And a point here, if you receive an email from a parent, a guardian, a sibling, a significant other, whatever, you are probably prevented by federal law of discussing that student's grade with this other person. So I would just let that person know, I cannot discuss this with you, and leave it at that. During the semester, so not at the end, but during the semester, when a student reaches out and says, "Hey, I'd like to talk about my grade or I'd like to argue my grade," typically what I'll do is I will meet with the student. The reason that I'll meet with the student is not to change their grade. It's not a negotiation. And I let them know that when they come in to meet with me. It's not a negotiation, and unless I made a mistake, your grade is not going to change. But I want you to succeed in my class, so let's use this performance to set you up for success on my future assignments in my class. This is also a great opportunity to meet with that student and let them know about resources on your campus, maybe a writing center, maybe tutoring services, maybe an Office of Student Life, maybe counseling services, depending on if they have other issues going on. But it's a great way to let them know about these other resources that could also help them in their academic life, their social life, their emotional life, or what have you. One thing that I think we should be careful not to do is not to give higher grades just because a student argued. I don't want us to reinforce grade grubbing. I don't want us to reinforce complaining when the student doesn't actually deserve the higher grade. I've had a lot of students tell me that the reason they ask and the reason they argue is because sometimes it works. I don't want to be another data point for them showing that it works. While it might make you feel nice and empathetic to help that student in that moment by boosting the grade and giving them something they didn't actually earn, it's actually unfair to all of your other students, most of whom respected your grading policy and didn't argue. Our job is not to be nice. Our job is to be fair. Another thing I recommend at this point, your grades are in, the assignments have been submitted, they've been graded, the students know how they did, is to remind your students that grades are not everything. Number one, they're not everything in your class. I don't have an assignment that is worth 100% of the points. So the assignments that I have, especially because I tend toward more frequent lower stakes assignments, you can do poorly on one or even a couple assignments in my class and probably be okay on your overall grade. So letting your students know the mathematical context of that after the fact when they might be freaking out, I think is important in assuaging some of the concerns your student might have and might minimize their tendency to argue. Now, if we're talking a final grade or something like that, it is possible that some of your students are going to exaggerate that importance and think, this is the grade that keeps me out of graduate school, medical school, law school, dental school, whatever. I don't know if that's going to be true for that student, and I don't want to fail to validate their feelings and their concerns and anxieties about that. But it is not one class that determines your entire career outlook. Something that I remind myself and I remind my students is that I don't give grades, I report grades. I report the grade that corresponds with your performance on the assessment in my class. Grades aren't up to me, grades are up to you. And while some students may not want to hear that, they may not want to accept that responsibility, I feel pretty good, having followed a lot of the recommendations that I shared with you today, that I set them up for success, I graded them fairly, and I reported it in context. So what I've done today is I've talked about recommendations for how to minimize, but probably not eliminate, grade arguments in your class. Because if you teach long enough, some students are going to argue your grades. If we focus on setting them up for success before the assessments go out, if we focus on being fair during the grading process, and if we focus on providing appropriate context to those grades when they are released, I think we're doing right by our students, and we're going to minimize a lot of those arguments. In the comments below, I would love to hear any tips that you have for avoiding grade arguments with your students. Thank you for watching this episode of Engage the Sage. Please like, subscribe, sign up for notifications, share us on social media, and we'll see you next time on Engage the Sage.